So let me set a timer. I am going to try to condense down to the best of my ability 5 years of events in approximately 20 minutes here and leave time for some questions. Um, as Shannon said, I do identify now as a butch lesbian that had been medicalized roughly 20 years ago. I have become so disturbed by what's happening in the name of trans, and that's changed a lot in the last 20 years, that I refuse to bear the name trans. Um, Up until about 5 or 6 years ago, I was quietly living my life as a trans man. I was married, we're raising kids, and I had built a career for myself as a registered nurse with a specialization in mental health. When all of this first came onto my radar, I was working at a clinic in Kelowna, BC, for youth. I was dedicated multidisciplinary services for youth. We did mental health services, primary care, social services, um, trying to provide as many different services under one roof as possible to minimize barriers to youth seeking help. My role there was clinical supervisor of a walk-in counseling program. But there was a point in our program we hadn't been providing gender affirming care. We did provide general services to youth that were trans identified, but we weren't providing hormone prescriptions, puberty blockers, or referrals to surgery. But at one point, about 30% of our client base was trans identified and started to ask more and more for those services. There was a increasing demand, and in the Kelowna area and the interior of BC, there really weren't many, if any, providers. We had some clients driving 4 or 5 hours to come and see us and request those services, because outside of the major urban centers, that just didn't exist. As a clinic, our administrators, anytime we see a growing client population or population saying that they're being underserved, generally speaking, if that happened in any other area of practice, it would cause us to pause and think, how can we better serve the population? So our physicians and our nurse practitioner did have an interest in learning how to provide gender affirming care, and we sought input from the provincial health authority. So Transcare BC is a department within the provincial health authority that oversees how this work is done throughout the province and resources both clinicians and helps coordinate some of the care for clients. So they came out to our clinic twice. Once when we were fairly new as a program to provide more general information, which I would describe as like cultural sensitivity training about how to use the right pronouns and make people feel comfortable and safe in your care, which at that time in itself didn't feel inappropriate. Um, but when we wanted to do a deeper dive into actually doing the clinical work, we engaged them again and said, okay, can you do some deeper clinical training with us? And they came back out and did another 2-day workshop that was pretty much identical to the first one that they did. There was no discussion of peer review evidence. There was no discussion about what is gender identity disorder, or now called gender dysphoria, or the sense of incongruence. So what is that from an evidence basis? How is it best diagnosed? How is it best supported? What are the different treatment options for it? So there was none of this clinically rigorous conversation that I would expect, because I was working in general mental health at that time and had a background in working for the provincial eating disorders in Vancouver. And so I've worked in different practice areas of nursing. I've attended many clinical conferences, have been involved in many clinical mentorship groups and communities of practice. I'm used to the conventions of how we speak to one another as clinicians and how we engage with evidence and debate evidence. And I wasn't seeing that whole culture that I'm used to in clinical practice seemed to be missing from the conversation about gender affirming care. I also hadn't been aware that a new model of care, which is what we call gender affirming care, that this is a new model of care. There are actually three historical models of care for how children and adults with different types of gender incongruence are treated and managed. So my clinic hadn't been aware that gender affirming care was now the dominant model and the expected model, which is quite different from the system when I went through it 20 years ago. There was a lot more assessment, diagnosis, screening by psychologists, etc. So while receiving this training, which just felt very empty, it was very based on personal narrative and community surveys, not peer review evidence or equipping us to understand what is the actual clinical condition at hand. It was very clear to me that that whole clinical framework and understanding has been completely replaced with more of a human rights framework connected to this gender ideology framework. That anyone who says that they're trans as an identity has a human right to do so without interference, comparing that to homosexuality, that if a person is gay or lesbian, that they get to have a sexual orientation without interference, or and have protected rights in law. So a similar model has been adopted to these trans identities, that everyone has a human right to be trans, and that anyone at any age who thinks they're trans just are trans, and that it's never our clinical role to ever question that, which is a very much a departure from understanding of the clinical development. My understanding of gender identity disorder is more from a developmental psychology framework and how that develops in childhood and what the normal trajectory of that developmental pathway is, which usually resolves itself. That, excuse me, that childhood sense of incongruence is a very common gay or lesbian experience. It is part of the developmental psychology of homosexuality and is very highly correlated with later adult homosexuality. And there are 13 studies to date showing that if you just love and support those kids, and not interfere, that typically that resolves itself by adolescence, and certainly by adulthood, when they realize that they have a sexual orientation and develop an identity as a gay man or a lesbian, that the gender nonconformity doesn't necessarily go away. That part isn't pathological. That is just a normal aspect of humanity, that there are differences, and there are more masculine women organically, there are more feminine men organically. That in itself isn't a problem, and that doesn't necessarily go away. But this drive or the belief that you are the opposite sex typically sheds off by adolescence or adulthood. So that is very clearly documented in the medical literature, and there are no studies that have ever contradicted that trajectory, which is why in the past we weren't medicalizing children. Because to medicalize those children means that we're medicalizing and converting homosexuals into heterosexuals. And that isn't the information that we're even allowed to provide our families and our kids, is this narrative arc of the psychological development and the sexual development of homosexuals has been completely hijacked by this new way of thinking that we can trace back to academia in the early 90s, which has completely pushed out. And I remember seeing that in university at the time, that lesbian specific voices or gay male specific voices in academia, or feminist voices in academia, were completely pushed out and silenced when queer theory took over. I had interest in pursuing grad school as an art historian at the time, and because my interests were in looking at historical examples of masculine presenting lesbians through our history, I was told I couldn't find an advisor to support that work unless I was willing to take a queer theory framework. So that was emerging in academia in the 90s, where all other voices, our ability to speak about our sexual orientations in a reality sex-based way, was no longer allowed. We were pushed out of academia. Our work couldn't be published, and some of us just couldn't find advisors to even do that work. And now we've seen these ideas trickle out and being taken up by major institutions, and governments, all levels of government, from municipal all the way up to international government. To the degree that I, as re-identified lesbian, am being quite severely canceled just by speaking about my own experiences as a lesbian, and how my own identity as a lesbian was hijacked by this ideology. Even I, as a 33-year-old who had been a part of lesbian communities well into my early 30s, due to circumstances in my life at the time that had been destabilizing. For example, the murder of a gay man in Vancouver at the time, and the breakdown of my long-term marriage after she had a head injury that changed her. So there were things going on in my life that had destabilized me, and then I saw a documentary on TV during that period of my life that was the beginnings of this new conceptualization of trans as a type of personhood, in ways similar to how gay might be seen as a type of personhood, completely stealing the narrative arc away from gay and lesbians, and then framing this sense of incongruence as, if you have this experience, it means you are a trans person. So it was a documentary, I think it was on CBC television in about 2004, 2000, maybe 2006, that it was a documentary about trans kids. And they were talking to children with a sense of incongruence and framing that as, if you have this experience, it means you are a trans person. Not that that's an aspect of the development of homosexuality, not that these kids might grow up to be butch lesbians or effeminate gay men, not that they had gender identity disorder. That was the beginnings of this narrative of, if you've experienced that, it means you are a trans person. So not only did it steal that narrative arc away from, and I bought that in my vulnerable state of mind. And the system as soon as I said out loud, well, that is my experience, the system very quickly swooped in and carried me along this medicalized pathway. My girlfriend at the time, very well-meaning, happened to be best friends with the social worker at the clinic in Vancouver, got me in right away. And after about 2 months of assessment, I mean, it all just happened very, very quickly, and all well-meaning. I think they all meant, having already been captured by this ideology, meant, I think, were well-meaning and meant to love and support me. But I ended up being carried down a pathway without any exploration or explanation of what my experience was, and how my current circumstances might have been impacting my decision. But getting back to my clinical work, my understanding of gender dysphoria and the different pathways to gender dysphoria, because there isn't a single one. The DSM outlines 3 different types. One being the one I just described, the childhood onset type, which is highly correlated with homosexuality. The second type, which is actually the largest cohort of heterosexual males who have a transvestic disorder with AGP. And then the smallest cohort being those with disorders of sex development, which is also part of my narrative. I was born with an ovotesticular DSD, which meant I had both ovarian and testicular tissue, which is probably why biologically I presented as more sex ambiguous. I had a very androgynous presentation. I was, as a teenager, I both masculinized and feminized. I did grow breasts, but I also grew a beard. And it's not uncommon with very specific DSDs. There are many different kinds of DSDs, so this isn't true of all of them. But with some DSDs, because we are more biologically just at the margins of what is expected of our sex, with certain DSDs, it's not uncommon to feel some confusion about what our sex is and which sex may be most appropriate for us to just live our lives and integrate best into society. And those are very complex ethical decisions, and there have been differences over the years in how clinicians have thought about that, and it's handled differently in different areas of the world. And they're very challenging ethical questions about quality of life and what makes the most sense in terms of social integration. So those 3 pathways are all in the current diagnostic manual that are used by psychiatrists. So this isn't distant historical information I'm giving you. This is in our current diagnostic manual. I was not allowed in the clinical setting to discuss that. I was not allowed to talk about gender dysphoria. I was not allowed to talk about those pathways to gender dysphoria. Um, so any questions that I had about doing this work well with these young people, I was met with a lot of hostility, which blew my mind because this to me is just common sense. And it was part of the discussion 20 years ago. And I have never been a trans activist. I wasn't connected to the trans community at this time. So my entry into doing this work was sort of a re-entry into the trans community. I hadn't been aware that this new way of thinking has completely taken over not only the culture of the community, but the way that the care itself is being provided. Transcare BC's website at the time even said that you don't have to be trans to access gender affirming care. So really what this means is that it's being seen as a human rights issue that people have, and even children have a right to do whatever they want with their bodies and identify however they wish and access permanent medical interventions just based on their saying, I want them. And I was being told that we don't really do assessment anymore. We only do a very brief screening to determine that they have the basic capacity to consent. So ruling out things like major cognitive impairment where they just wouldn't understand the medical interventions. But that the bar was very low because when I started assessing these youth, and I assessed approximately 60 youth over an 8-month period, and found them to be very, very highly complex with things like autism, ADHD, or severe trauma backgrounds, including sexual trauma, that most of them were biologically female, and most of those girls were same-sex attracted. Um, which in itself was unheard of because historically it was mostly boys, like the pre-gay boys being brought into clinics by their parents, and men with gynephilia. So historically it was almost entirely males with few exceptions. So there have been some butch lesbians like myself that medicalize, but historically it has been mostly biological males. So even the fact that I was seeing approximately 70% natal females in itself was something new and alarming. But most of those girls had severe mental health issues or trauma backgrounds, and many of them said they had no childhood history of gender nonconformity at all, and that was confirmed by their parents. Like my daughter was a very normal girly girl who was happy wearing dresses and never brought up ever feeling like she was a boy. But all of a sudden in adolescence wants to medicalize and become a boy. That is not the typical pathway of gender identity disorder, and that's not what I was seeing in my cohort 20 years ago when I did this. So I'm seeing these things in my practice and was not well supported by the clinical community. Any concerns that I raised about the safety of this model of care, given the youth that I was seeing, was met with hostility to the point where activists came after me. They boycotted our clinic and I was removed from my role. So I was so disturbed by that and the trajectory of that and the backlash against me that that's what prompted me to create the Gender Dysphoria Alliance in 2021. Um, and I started connecting with clinicians because I wanted to blow the whistle. I wanted to do something to push back on this. But at that time, there was no support for me to blow the whistle. I mean, media outlets weren't willing to speak with me. Politicians weren't willing to speak with me. I wasn't supported by the health authority. So I didn't know what to do. But a few other trans men who also see this problem circled around me because the trans activists that came after me were mostly of the AGP cohort. And it was quite brutal and frightening at the time. You know, the smear campaigns that they did, the calls to my employer, not just my local employer, but our national head office of my employer, really trying to smear me, and they were successful having me removed from my role. So these trans men circle around me, and that's how we created the Gender Dysphoria Alliance in order to provide me a circle of some protection and solidarity so that I could continue speaking publicly about these things. And we use the organization to start lobbying in Canada. So one of the first lobby efforts I did was about our conversion therapy law that was passed by our federal government. Not that I in any way support conversion therapy, but the way that that was written was very deceptive and manipulative, and was a way of introducing gender identity concepts into federal law. There's no mention in the conversion therapy law anything about gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder. And it's basically written to say that any effort to try to change someone's gender identity is illegal. We were, together with many other lobbyers, successful with having two clauses added: one that protects psychotherapy and an exploration of one's gender identity development, and another, excuse me, another clause that protects comprehensive assessment prior to any medicalization, which gives us some wiggle room to still do good clinical work, but the activists still make that impossible. So even though it is perfectly legal for me to do the work that I want to do with these young people, I know that the activists will still smear me, cancel me. They've threatened to report me to the College of Nursing, and they've threatened to accuse me of practicing conversion therapy. The other thing that the Gender Dysphoria Alliance did was create a podcast called the Transparency Podcast, which we're no longer running, but it ran for a good about 2 years. Our original concept for that, because we were trying to find ways of pushing back without getting ourselves into a lot of trouble. So one of the concepts we had as a small group of trans men was saying, well, the conversations that we have in private are quite different from how this public narrative is being pushed. So when we're vulnerable and just speaking to one another around a campfire or around a kitchen table, those conversations sound quite different without the veil, the public veil of trans. So we said, well, there's nothing unethical or illegal about a group of trans men having a conversation, recording it, and putting it out there in public. So that was our original concept and what we started to do. But that quickly changed, and we started to bring in guests, subject matter experts on gender dysphoria, or subject matter experts about how this is playing out in our society as a whole. We had Kathleen Stock, for example, come on and talk to us about the lesbian feminist perspective and how things like self-ID are impacting women's rights, and in particular lesbian rights. And more recently, I have been involved in supporting some of the provincial efforts to push back on the gender ideology in schools. So New Brunswick and Saskatchewan have both asked me to intervene in cases defending their policies, not allowing children to be socially transitioned or in public schools without parental knowledge or clinical oversight. So I'm happy to support those policies, which I agree with. And I've also been asked, in anticipation of Alberta's new policies being challenged in court, I've already been asked to intervene in that case, which I'm happy to do. I think their policies are the most comprehensive in Canada. I think their messaging and their policies are spot on in my opinion. Maybe I would maybe recommend minor tweaks here and there, but I think for Canada it's a milestone, and it's really important that they succeed in implementing those policies. And I hope are the leaders throughout Canada in clawing this back and doing some safeguarding for children in particular, and women. I met another whistleblower, I think about a year and a half ago, from the US, and then we met at a clinical conference in Finland, because I am connected to an international group of clinicians, and including the Tavistock whistleblowers from the UK who reported similar concerns as I did at my clinic, that basically when it comes to young children, we're basically medicalizing and converting a large percentage of pre-gay kids. So I initially connected with that community through Dr. Lisa Littman, who did the research on the rapid onset gender dysphoria phenomenon. And she was graciously able to connect me with other clinicians that are concerned. And so I met Jamie Reed, an American whistleblower, at a clinical conference in Finland about almost 2 years ago. And we came up with the idea of co-founding an organization called the LGBT Courage Coalition to help support whistleblowers and try to draw whistleblowers out of the pediatric medicine system. And we were successful in getting a few whistleblowers to come forward, and those clinics have subsequently been shut down. I'm no longer with the coalition, just for various reasons, but they're doing excellent work. They've started to do a lot more direct action work, just showing up to conferences on the ground and doing demonstrations and pushing back. In terms of what I'm doing now, because I'm pivoting and refocusing some of my efforts, I do want to rebuild my nursing practice. And that's part of the reason why I need to be careful and make smart decisions about how I engage in the public conversation, because I do want to preserve my ability to practice as a nurse and rebuild my career and rebuild my life. um, so what I've been working on now is working with other lesbians, in particular gender nonconforming lesbians, to try to claw back our identities and our narrative arcs, um, away from this queer way of thinking, which we feel the girls coming after us desperately need to understand themselves, and their sexual orientations in a way that is healthy and realistic and grounded in reality. Um, and I'm trying to find ways of engaging the lesbian community. We've got a huge dilemma ahead of us because so many young lesbians have medicalized or continue to medicalize who will pass as men. And we're expecting a tidal wave of trans, excuse me, we're expecting a tidal wave of trans regret as this narrative becomes corrected. And I have full confidence that we will, and we must correct this. And I think a lot of these young people who have been absolutely lied to, who never even had the opportunity to conceptualize themselves as gay or lesbian because they've been completely lied to from day one, are going to need a lot of help and support to reframe their identities and to heal from what's happened to them and to find pathways back into gay and lesbian communities, which is going to be a huge dilemma because the effects of testosterone in particular, you're not able to see my face except for my photo there. I will never look like a woman ever again. The effects of testosterone are permanent. For me to resume any female appearance would basically be the same process that a man would need to go through to be a trans woman, plus some extra steps and complications for me. And none of that currently, there's no infrastructure for that. Those services don't exist. There's no billing codes for those services. So let's say, for example, because there's a number of ways that testosterone changed me. The beard on my face, yes, I could have hair, laser removal and remove that. The hair on my head will never grow back. Yes, I could get implants to restore my hairline, but that would all be paid out of pocket and thousands of dollars, and may not be successful. To get breast implants, that's complicated because the chest surgery that I had, it's not a typical mastectomy like in breast cancer. It's its own kind of surgery, and there really isn't any clinical competence in how do we reverse that. Like, that would be entirely experimental. Not all surgeons are qualified to do that, and because there's no billing code for it, I would pay tens of thousands of dollars out of pocket in order to do that. I will never get a uterus back. I mean, these changes are permanent. So to reintegrate women that look like men into lesbian spaces that are desperately trying to defend those spaces from the infiltration of men is going to be extremely challenging. And I'm very concerned about this, this generation of young people who have been duped, who are eventually going to need to find communities and a way back home into their actual sex, are going to find it very challenging because they're going to be passing as the opposite sex. So that is some of the work that I'm doing, is in anticipation of our movement being successful, um, and the fallout that I'm anticipating with these young people and their families. I'm trying to get ahead of that arc and to try to build some of the infrastructure now so that we're ready to catch these kids when they eventually crash. and realize what's happened to them. So one example is I spent some time this summer at the lesbian events have gone completely underground and in secret because one of the impacts of gender identity ideology is any man can show up and say, I identify as a woman and barge into these spaces and gawk at lesbians. And there's been a long history of that happening that is now being legally facilitated for them, and it has made that easier for these men to do that with no defenses and no legal boundaries for women or lesbians to say, no, we want some spaces for ourselves. There had been a long history of for example, the Michigan Women's Music Festival, where men had threatened these women just for organizing a music festival, men threatening them with corrective rape, threatening them with murder, and two women in that community actually were murdered by a trans woman. So these spaces, there's a lot of defensiveness in these spaces because it has escalated into very real violence in the past. To allow a woman who looks like me into that space was very challenging, but I was invited. Some of these events are now being rebuilt very quietly. I was invited into a women's space this summer to lead a workshop talking to these women about what do we do about this? What do we do to catch these girls when they eventually want to come back home? And that was extremely difficult work because of that history and all the trauma that these women have experienced at the hands of men who haven't respected their boundaries. In walks someone who looks like me, and at that time I had a full beard and very much 100% passed as male. Came into that space to talk to them about what do we do about women that look like me? And if women like me are allowed back into those spaces, how do we keep the men out if we can't rely on our visual cues? How do we heal some of the gut reactions that some of these women have to seeing a man's face or hearing a man's voice when I show up? So that was very difficult work. It's a huge dilemma that we're going to need to face in anticipation of these girls needing spaces for themselves in the future. So we're starting that work now in pockets of the lesbian communities. Some are not able to join that conversation with us. It's just too emotional. It's too painful. But I'm heartened by fairly large numbers of lesbians who see this problem, who really care about these kids, and we are working on finding ways, creating pathways for these girls to be able to eventually have spaces in which they can thrive and be supported. So that's the work I'm doing now, and other projects related to building our community back, building it back in ways that are healthy, in ways in which we are constructive, positive citizens, amongst other lesbians, especially butch lesbians, who are absolutely horrified by what's happening in our name, in our nations around the globe. So I think I'm probably at my time or a little bit over time now, so I'm going to stop there, and I'd be happy to take any questions.